Hey everybody, welcome to a joint presentation from the Montana Renewable Energy Association and the Montana Environmental Information Center. We are talking tonight about what's the Public Service Commission? Why does it matter? If you're here because you have questions, because you're curious to learn more, because you want to know the depth and breadth to which the Public Service Commission might impact your life and your electricity bills, you're in the right place. We'll talk about the the basics, why the PSC exists, what they do, who they are, and then later on, we'll talk a little bit about some current rulemaking that's going on and things like the Northwestern Energy rate case and resource adequacy investigation. So covering quite a range of topics tonight. We'll have time for questions at the end. And as I said earlier, if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we might address them as we go. And if they're deeper dives, we'll get to them at the end. So I'll let our speakers introduce themselves.
Hey, you want me to go to the next slide, McKenna?
Oh, sure. That sounds fine. And while you're doing that, I will say hi. Hello, everyone. My name is McKenna Sellers. I'm the Executive Director for Montana Renewable Energy Association. Thank you, MEIC, for co-presenting and doing this presentation with us. I'm really excited to be here and to talk PSC with everybody here.
And, oh, did I do that? Sorry, my name is Ian Lund. I am the Clean Energy Policy Director here at MEIC. I think McKenna has some slides on who we are, but I don't, so I'll just jump right in, say a little bit about who we are. MEIC is a nonprofit environmental advocate whose purpose is to protect Montana's clean and healthful environment. And our work ranges from closing dirty power plants to protecting clean water and clean air. We do some work on hard rock mining, and my work focuses on utility governance and the clean energy transition. Back to you, McKenna.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay. So for this, understanding the PSC presentation, and I will give you a quick, speedy elevator pitch about MREA and who we are, but we've split the presentation into two sections. We're starting with the building blocks of the PSC. What's the structure? What does it mean? And how do they make decisions related to renewable energy and climate? Like, how do we combine the complicated stuff with like, okay, now how does it apply to my values? Then we'll get into a more detail-oriented view with Ian, where he'll go into detail about some of the dockets that we're tracking at the PSC right now, some of which MEIC has a much more active role, but it's still important, I think, to both of our organizations. So before we get super started, and so MREA, if you want to go to the next slide, I imagine if you're members are involved with MEIC, I'm really glad that you are, and I hope that you become a member of MEIC and MREA if you are not already. And Katie put that in the chat box if you want to learn more about how to sign up for either of those organizations. But a little about MREA, we're over 20 years old, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're a member-driven organization. Our mission is to foster the growth of renewable energy across the state through education, through advocacy at the state legislature, through getting involved at the Public Service Commission, and through industry engagement with our installers and business owners as well. So that's a little bit of our role and what we're up to. Before we go ahead and go to the next slide, Ian, if you don't mind. Before we get started on the content of what we're going through, I wanted you all to be aware that MREA has an Understanding the PSC guidebook. And if you see the picture of my dog, she thinks that this guidebook is very tantalizing and tasty. There's lots of good stuff in there. So if you would like one of these PSC guidebooks, we'll be covering some of what is within that booklet on this presentation. I won't be covering every little piece of it. But if you would like to have a hard copy of that booklet, I put a form sign up in the chat, and we'll be happy to mail one to your doorstep. There's certainly some good relevant information there. We also have the online version, and Katie put that in the chat. So I want to start with you can go ahead and change the slide, please. I want to start with the 10,000 foot view of the PSC utilities and the services they provide. So if we're going super high level, we realize that most communities have essential services structures, like how we get our water, how we build our roads and use roads, maybe our power and electricity access. These are all things that we count on and rely on a daily basis. Some utility providers are monopolies, meaning that one business has control over the sales, operation, and delivery of a certain service. Monopolies don't compete in a market the same way that a competitive market might, where you have multiple players who are vying to get your business and get your dollar, and they're going to really try hard to make sure that they earn your business. A monopoly doesn't have those same motivators. So monopolies don't have that same competition present in their business transactions. If that's left unchecked, this can be problematic. Monopolies also have captive customers, meaning that, you know, if they're the only game in town, you only have one choice. You don't have the option to go to another company that might be offering a similar service. So in my example, because if I'm trying to think about monopolies in my brain for essential services, I'm in the township of Pizza Land, and in this imaginary situation, everyone has to have pizza. Like, it is a basic human function that we all need pizza. But my company, Mac Pizza Plus, is the only company that sells pizza. And so I don't have to compete anywhere. There's no pizza at the grocery store. You can't even make your own. You don't have the ingredients for it. So you have to have pizza in your life. If I own this company, the only one who provides pizza, what might I be motivated to do with my prices? Any guesses, savvy business people? I'm going to jack up those prices for sure. I know how much you guys want pizza. I have a corner on the market. I know that I can be real successful, so I'm going to do that. So in the real world, investor-owned companies have captive customers. That's true. And they'll offer services like not pizza, but electricity, water and wastewater, telecommunication, rail, and pipeline transport. So to avoid this price jacking that I just did with my pizza company, we have regulated utilities, and those utilities are regulated by the Public Service Commission. We call these, just like I said, regulated utilities. The PSC doesn't run the business. You know, they don't have their hands in every single transaction. It's still a private business, but the PSC helps maintain the balance of the interest of the customer and the ratepayers who don't want to be paying an arm and a leg, and the need for the utility to provide reliable service and remain a healthy and profitable company so that they can continue into the future. Balancing those interests is a whole lot of work, and that's the big question. It's like, how do we effectively balance those interests? Next slide. The Montana PSC has roots dating back over 100 years. Actually, their roots date back to 1907, which was less than 20 years after Montana became a state. And it was originally set up to ensure safe and dependable railroad service, because it didn't make sense to have 20 different rails coming through our state. It just was too complicated. And we also wanted to make sure we had dependable service when there was the boom in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to have reliable service for customers. So that's where they started. And over the years, the PSC has added more and more regulatory oversight and increasing responsibility to make sure that Montanans have safe and reliable service from investor-owned utilities. You'll hear words like affordable, reliable, and sustainable. Those are things you see on the PSC website, and I think that's how the PSC typically describes its purpose. One quick mention on the distinction between investor-owned utilities and rural electric co-ops. So we just talked about the things that the PSC regulates. I'm honing in more so on electricity, like where we're getting our power, how Montanans get their power. Investor-owned utilities are regulated by the Public Service Commission, but rural electric co-ops are not. There's a pretty big constituency in Montana that gets their power from rural electric co-ops. There's 25 of them across the state. They serve thousands of Montanans. So I do want to make sure that you all know we have two investor-owned utilities in the electricity world, and that's Northwestern Energy and MDU. Those are overseen by the Montana Public Service Commission. A little bit about the PSC structure, slide in. So the PSC is made up of commissioners themselves and also a really strong staff. So the Montana Public Service Commission is comprised of 5 commissioners. They serve 4-year terms. They are elected. We are one of 11 states that elect our public service commissioners rather than appointed or any other mechanism. They are partisan positions, and the Public Service Commission typically will provide reports to the legislature, and they give those reports to the Energy and Telecommunications Interim Committee or to the energy committees during the session. If you want to be a commissioner, there's no required prior experience in economics, administration, utility regulation. And the other thing about being the other component, the very key component of the Public Service Commission is you have your 5 commissioners, but you have staff making recommendations and doing a lot of the detailed and specialist work that's required. The staff have 3 divisions, that's regulatory, legal, and centralized services. So that's our big broad brush structure about like, okay, who makes up the PSC? Slide. It's important to remember that the PSC does not make laws. The PSC operates in a quasi-judicial fashion, so it wouldn't make sense for them to be both making laws and being the judge of laws. The legislature creates and modifies laws, then those get signed by the governor. And it's the PSC's job to follow the law while again balancing the interest of ratepayers and utilities. Next slide. The PSC is comprised, or the commissioners themselves make up 5 different districts that are split up across the state. This was recently revised by a judge. It's actually not even codified in Montana law yet. That's probably coming in 2023. But we have these 5 districts and there's commissioners for each of them. Slide again. Oh no, where'd Commissioner Fielder go? There she is. I did not mean to make that animated. I'm glad that she wasn't missing. So District 4, Commissioner Fielder, I'm just going to go west to east. Commissioner Johnson in District 5. Commissioner Johnson is term limited. There are 2 candidates that are up for election in November in District 5. That's John Rebke and Annie Bukacek. I have, just so you all know, they're there. We'll never tell you how to vote because MEIC and MREA are nonprofit organizations. But we do really want to encourage you to look up those people because these folks are elected, like you're making the call there. So get to know their values, get to know their background, and make sure you do vote. I really encourage everybody to vote. We got Commissioner Brown in District 3. He is currently the president. District 1, Commissioner Pinocci, and he's running for re-election as well, but he's unopposed. So we can see that on the ballot if you live in any of the counties in District 1. And District 2, Commissioner O'Donnell. Next slide. So now that we know more about the structure of the PSC, I want to tell you in the context of the renewable energy world, some of the things and decisions that the PSC makes that we think are really influential for a clean energy future. One of them is long-term supply resource planning. And so Ian is actually going to end up talking a little bit about one of those long-term resource supply plans for Northwestern. That draft has recently been published, so I don't want to go into too much detail about this, but this is how utilities will submit plans to the Public Service Commission about how they plan to meet the needs of customers and provide reliable service in the long term. So it's kind of like a snapshot of, at this point in time, this is what our utilities are thinking for, like what kind of power they need to acquire, how they're going to meet demand, and how they're going to do that safely and effectively. Then it's the PSC's job, and this is actually codified in the MCA. The PSC doesn't approve or reject. They don't say yay or nay to the utilities business plan, but they are required to provide comments. And just a little fun fact, I guess we could say that both of our regulated electric utilities, MDU and Northwestern Energy, they're both required to provide some type of resource plan, these long-term resource plans, but the structure of each and the name of each are slightly different, and they're in 2 different sections of the Montana Code annotated. And some of you might know why, legacy of dereg and re-reg, but that's just something to know that the IRP process looks a little different for both of these utilities. Next slide. Another important focus for the PSC in the context of renewables is contract terms for qualifying facilities. So QFs are a certain type of generating facility under, thank you, great question. The MCA is the Montana Code annotated, so that's Montana state law. So remember, like I said at one of those slides, the legislature creates laws, the PSC enacts or follows the law. So qualifying facilities. Qualifying facilities exist because in the 70s during the energy crisis, there was encouragement on the federal level to create more domestic independence of our energy and not to rely so much on foreign oil. So we have these qualifying facilities that there's rules under the federal government, but then the states also enact their own rules about what gets to be qualified as a QF. Utilities have to purchase this energy and it's limited. So you can't have more than 80 megawatts of power production capacity, but they can also be smaller too. And so the PSC, it plays a role in setting rates for these qualifying facilities, these QFs. QFs can be hydro, solar, wind, thermal. So that includes anything burning oil, gas, or coal. So I don't want to give the impression that QFs are strictly clean energy, because they are not. It includes renewables, and a good chunk of them are renewables, but some are not. There are over 40 QFs in Montana. And according to the latest from NARUC, which stands for the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissions, because Montana is one utility commission or utility public service commission, but there are more all over the country. Montana has 364 megawatts of QF generation in the state. Setting rates for QFs, we go back a couple. Setting rates for QFs has been a point of contention over the years, because the state's requirements, depending on who you ask, the renewable energy developers or some developers say that the terms are not viable for them, and then it's harder to get QF projects off the ground. However, they do happen, and we do know, according to Northwestern Energy's 20-year plan, that there is some generating capacity in the queue that's ready to be built if we can successfully land on some QF contract terms. That includes 100 megawatts of hybrid wind, 180 megawatts of solar hybrid, 200 megawatts of wind, and 240 megawatts of solar. So that's a lot. That's a lot of QF potential power if we can get those off the ground. Next slide. Another huge role from the Public Service Commission is creating customer classes and setting rates. So deciding how much we all pay on our electricity bills. This is a big one. So the PSC determines what regulated utility customers pay for electricity. Different electricity users are going to be having different electricity use habits. My household is probably consuming energy at a different rate and at different times than a manufacturing facility in Billings or a big Walmart maybe in Missoula. So because we have different consumption habits and trends, and we use our electricity differently, that typically means that the PSC will put these different user groups into different classifications. And so we call those rate classes. Not all users are necessarily created equal. And so by creating customer classes, the PSC can set different rates for different classes based on use. Like I said there, the example of a large industrial business versus a residence. And so they can be charged differently. The PSC sets your monthly base charge as well as the volumetric, like how much you spend. So there's typically like a supply charge as well as how much energy you are consuming. There can also be other special charges that get complicated if we go too deep into them, something like demand charges or time of use charges. Some other states have implemented that, and I think we have as well, but we don't want to get too deep in the weeds. Just know that there are other charges that the PSC can also set. Next slide. Well, that's a lot of complicated things. What can I, as a general person in Montana, do about any of it? Great question. So how can everyday people get involved in such a system or be involved in the PSC? We know about the structure. We know about the important things they do in terms of setting rates for qualifying facilities, for setting rates for how much you spend on your electricity, and planning for 20-year and long-term planning. Bottom line, I think it's really important for everyday people to weigh in. This is a government agency. The Public Service Commission works for the people of Montana. And it's important to keep our commissioners and our decision makers that we vote into office accountable to the people that voted them into office. And so it's just a good reminder that in this case, I mean, we vote for our commissioners and they should be hearing from us. Next slide. So there are a few things that you can comment on. You can generally just reach out to your commissioner, and I have the slide, I think it's this coming slide. We don't have to jump to it quite yet, but I'm going to put it in the chat. Everyone in meeting. I just added the PSC URL. Like if you follow that link, we can show you how to just generally reach out to your commissioner if you have a specific question of them. If you want to provide a comment on a certain case, like the Northwestern Energy long-term resource supply plan, or maybe something else. The PSC has a conduit for you to reach out, and there is a mechanism for public comment, either through their web portal or even through their public meetings. They have weekly meetings. But another thing I wanted to touch on are dockets and the different types of proceedings that the Public Service Commission will undertake. They're split into two basic categories. The decisions that the PSC makes in these proceedings, they're either contested cases or not contested. Contested cases go through a slightly different process. It looks a little more like a court case. It includes interveners, there's lawyers involved for representation, and as far as the public's involvement in a contested case, the public can comment. However, it's just not part of the evidentiary record, and the commissioners can't reference it when making their decision. I still think it's important to comment on contested cases. One example is a rate case. Like if Northwestern Energy, which they are, they're going through a rate case right now. That's a contested case. And that means that public comment is tracked. It's still captured, but it's not put in the evidentiary record. That's just a distinction that I want to make sure that you know about. But if you reach out to your commissioner with a question, they could certainly bring that up during discovery or cross-examination, and that could lead to getting something in the record. So public input is still important there, although it's just treated slightly differently. Then the other type of proceeding are uncontested cases. So those are things like rulemaking, or if the PSC is going through some sort of investigatory question they want to answer. That is the structure of that looks a lot like if a bill was going through the legislature. There's a hearing, public comment is a part of the record, and the commissioners can use public comment when making their final decision. Next slide. So we're still answering this question, like, how the heck can I be involved in any of this? This here is just a screenshot of the Public Service Commission's EDI portal. I think it's super helpful. It's actually a really nice way. If you want to nerd out on energy issues, you can track what's going on at the PSC through this portal. And we have this like login at mt.gov portal. You can just push continue as guest. And from there, if you go to the next slide, it takes you to this page where you can choose to submit a comment through the web. So sometimes that's tricky because like, oh, I don't have a state login. How do I do this? You can just push continue as guest, and now you can comment as just an everyday Montanan, reach out to your commissioner, comment on a proceeding. Here's your path. And I can put that in the chat again. Another engagement mechanism that I want to make sure folks know about is, as of this August, the Public Service Commission has started to post their work sessions, their open work sessions, on their YouTube page. I just learned about this. I think it's kind of cool. For those who don't know, I started at MREA a month ago, and so I'm still getting back into the swing of the energy world. But I was really excited because when I was working on PSC issues, the PSC did not have a YouTube page with their work sessions captured. So that's kind of a cool new thing for the public to look at. And I just put the PSC YouTube page in the chat. Next slide. Another place for public involvement is the entity called the Montana Consumer Council. They're written into the Montana Constitution, so they're pretty darn important. It's a state government office, and what they're supposed to do is represent consumer and public interest in PSC case proceedings. It's a lot of really smart lawyers over there, and they've got a ton of regulatory experience. However, the tricky part about the Consumer Council is they don't just have like a public portal for people to ask questions of the Consumer Council or ask what their current position is. What they're supposed to do is represent the interests of consumers. And they do that. I think they do okay, but there really isn't a mechanism for capturing what people think. I think that could be improved upon in the future, but I did want to make sure you guys know that the Montana Consumer Council exists and they're an important piece of the puzzle. Next slide. Another way you can be involved as a just general Montanan everyday person who might not nerd out on dockets and PSC regulatory proceedings as much as Ian or myself is to be involved in groups like MREA and MEIC. One thing that we can do is bring the expertise and make sure that we're distilling information in a way so that you know what's going on and you know the mechanisms that you can use to be involved in the decisions that affect all of us, that affect our pocketbooks and affect the future of Montana. So join groups that align with the stuff that you care about. If you care about renewable energy access and affordability in Montana, you should be a member of MREA, another shameless plug. And if you aren't already a member of MEIC, you should be a member of theirs too. We can bridge that research and expertise and then help provide key info on climate and clean energy issues that matter to all of us and they matter to future generations. Okay, it's all connected. I think that's the bottom line. So at this point, I'm going to pass it to Ian to give you more brass tacks about what's going on at the PSC right now.
Thank you so much, McKenna. Little shameless plug for MEIC as well. I was just looking at our Down to Earth, which is our quarterly newsletter in which we talk about all this stuff and all the issues that we're watching and stuff that people should pay attention to. I referenced it earlier just because I was like, oh, did I get this right? And it's literally like, I could check this slide. Anyway, I just want to say thank you, everyone who is here and has stayed this far. This stuff is, you know, it's not the most easily sort of grasped stuff. These energy topics they kind of boring sometimes. They like aren't as interesting to everyone as they are to McKenna and I. But it's like it's really important stuff. And it's interesting because, you know, your utility is one of the few things that you spend money on literally every day, paying for electricity. And I think more people should be concerned about where their money is going and what it's being used for. And so getting engaged at the PSC, whose entire job is essentially to protect our pocketbooks and to make sure that money is being spent well, I think is really important. So I just thank you all for being here. Some quick disclaimers before I really get rolling. This rate case, which I'm going to talk about, it's fresh. We're still learning. I'm still learning. I mean, in this job, I'm learning every day. But, you know, this is just to say that we're still figuring out everything that's in this rate case. And while I am going to talk about some stuff, it's not a complete picture. And I encourage you to follow MEIC and just sign up for updates if you want to learn more, because we are going to be sharing a lot more information as we learn more. And my second disclaimer is just weeds alert. The things are going to get maybe a little wonky. I sometimes am not the best at distilling everything down to sort of like the common man's level. And if there's anything that's like going over your head, please just literally drop something in the chat. Be like, what is blank? And I promise I will go back and I will try to explain that. Okay. So McKenna did a great job of explaining what the PSC does. And we are going to take a look at some specific things that they're looking at right now. And we're going to start with the rate case because that affects all of our pocketbooks if you are in Northwestern territory, which I assume you are, because most Montanans are. So, oh, right, just before we get into the whole rate discussion, you know, raising rates, people don't like to hear it, people don't like to pay more, but we do need to pay money to get new things on the energy system. And that is true when Northwestern wants to build a fossil fuel plant and when they want to make us pay for coal strip. And that's true for building renewable energy and energy efficiency programs and such. Like it all costs money, but the PSC's job is to make sure that we're spending money on the right things, right? That we're not wasting money, we're not overspending on resources. So it's like, for example, you're going to hear some crazy numbers about how much the gas plant costs that Northwestern is building. And I just encourage you to think about it. Is that maybe the best way to spend that money? That's what we're thinking about. And hopefully that's what the PSC is thinking about too. So Northwestern's rate case. So here charted on the right are all the utilities in the Northwest, or most of them, I guess. And the blue line at the top is Northwestern Energy. That is how much per kilowatt hour on average electricity costs. As you can see, we have taken the #1 spot with this. If this rate case goes through, we will take the #1 spot for most expensive electricity in the region. And that is sort of just the beginning, because, you know, a lot of this comes from new resources that Northwestern wants to build. And that will not be, as we'll see later, those are not will not be the last resource that Northwestern wants to build in the next couple of years. So yeah, what does this mean for the average person? So for Northwestern customers paying 750 kilowatt hours, or using 750 kilowatt hours a month, which is frankly more than I use in my little apartment here in Helena, they'll pay $134 more in utility bills annually. That is, and if you live in a bigger house and use more energy, that you'll probably pay even more. And that is just the interim rate that the PSC approved. Northwestern is actually seeking a 25% rate increase, which will increase the average utility bill by $276. And again, the more energy you use, the more you're going to pay. Lori Byron asks a great question: how does that compare to Montana co-ops rates? I'm going to be upfront with a disclaimer again. Because I work with regulated utilities, I don't know that much about co-ops, but they tend to be less, is my understanding. But also, it very much depends on the co-op and how they manage their resources and where they get their energy from. Going back to the slide. So why the increase? Well, as I mentioned, this gas plant reliability rider is the mechanism which Northwestern is introducing. And there's also a bunch of distribution system costs that Northwestern is sliding in here as well, that honestly, I still have to dig into. So let's talk about this gas plant. Or there's something else I wanted to say. Right. Oh, yeah. So the PSC, as McKenna said, they are in charge of setting the rates, but the rates that we pay are usually brought by the utility in what's called a rate case. And that is a contested proceeding. If you remember back to earlier, where it's a judicial case where they don't really take public comment because it's sort of a legal proceeding. It'd be like lobbying a judge. But, you know, the people like MEIC who can come in and they can ask questions, we sort of represent the public, or we like to think we do. And there are other groups that do as well on sort of these issues. So the gas plant, it's known as the Yellowstone County Generating Station, formerly known as the Laurel Generating Station. It is a methane gas plant of 175 megawatts. To get that to kilowatts, which is what you use in your electricity bill, you multiply by 1,000 or something. I think it's 1,000. And it's slated to cost $286 million. Somehow that comes to $54 million a year for 20 years, which actually comes out to $1 billion being charged in total to, well, actually more than $1 billion if you really carry the fours. Yeah, over 20 years, which is a crazy amount of money. And it's interesting to think, is this the best way to actually spend $1 billion on our energy system? And how perhaps could we maybe have gotten more mileage out of that? Or can we still get more mileage out of that? Because this is, again, it's a rate case. It's not set in stone yet. The PSC could approve or deny. And then maybe they should. And the reason for that is the approach that Northwestern is taking with paying for this gas plant, right? So they're doing something called a reliability rider. And this is where it gets wheezy. So please, if it's like, just if I can simplify anything, let me know. So you have to understand traditional rate making, which is you put the risk of spending huge amounts of money on the utility. And the reason for this is you want the utility to be very cautious with spending $1 billion. And they want to make sure that they're spending it well and they're spending it efficiently, and they're not just simply spending a ton of money so that they can make a bunch of money. The way that utilities business models work is they get basically a percentage of everything they spend back from ratepayers. So that's how their shareholders make money. So it's an investor-owned utility. So the idea is that you would, in the traditional rate making model, the utility goes and it decides to build an economical plant, and then it comes to the PSC and they say, hey, look, we built this plant. It is like the best that we could do for the lowest amount of money. We think it's going to be great. It's not going to raise everyone's rates. No one's going to be mad at us. And the PSC looks at that and they're like, okay, great. And if they totally blew it and built something that was actually extremely expensive and unnecessary, the PSC would be no, you can't charge customers that. That's actually, yeah, that's outrageous. We're not going to let you, fleece our customers like that. And that's, that's how it's supposed to work. And in Montana, we actually had a bit of a different system until recently. We had something called pre-approval. And so that kind of flips the model on its head, where before the utility builds anything, they go to the PSA and they say, hey, please, 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 we really want to build this. It's going to cost this. What do you think? And the PSA either says yes or they say no. And if they say yes, all the costs associated with that are just put in the rates, and the utility can start collecting and it can start building that plant. Now that it's important to note, the pre-approval model was actually struck down by a judge last spring. And the reason for that was because it was quote unquote special legislation, which specifically was written for Northwestern so that Northwestern could do its pre-approval stuff, which pre-approval was great in terms of risk, right? Because it means that there's actually no risk to building the plant because they did all their due diligence beforehand, and they got the check from the PSC, and they're like, all right, great, we're good to go. But it was struck down. And so what this reliability rider is trying to do is they're trying to get the PSC to approve basically people they're basically asking for pre-approval, but worse, because there is actually not that due diligence that formal pre-approval process had. So they're just saying, hey, we're going to need this for reliability reasons. If you want to keep the lights on, we're going to need to build this resource. And so can you just approve us with this rate? And we'll just start building. And then, we can just kind of look at the prudence of it later. But we'll have already built it and we've already collected a bunch of money. And at this point, rates are already up. You might as well just say, just give us that money. So that's sort of basically, we're not sure it's legal for one thing, because it's pre-approval, which is struck down. And it's not really a common practice for utilities to do. They kind of either do this one or another thing. And the concerning thing is that this is the model that you wanting to pay for this gas plant, which they had submitted a pre-approval application for, but then rescinded it. And our concern is not only that it's going to be paid for this gas plant, which there's been no due diligence on, it's also because of the way they've written it, it can be used for the next gas plant that they want to build. And they do want to build one, as you'll see later. Yeah, so that's the rate case. Moving on, we're going to look at another thing happening at the PSC, and this is their resource adequacy investigation. Now, what is resource adequacy? Let's just start with that. Resource adequacy is how we keep the lights on. It's meeting the electricity. It's making sure we have enough electricity to send to all the people that are using it, the demand. So we got the supply and we got the demand. And everyone looks at resource adequacy. Every single utility in the country, probably around the world, looks at resource adequacy. We also have specific organizations in the US who do resource adequacy studies. We have the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, and we have the North American Electric Reliability Council Corporation, NERC. And so everyone's looking at resource adequacy, and it's incredibly important, especially as we transition to a more renewable powered grid, that we get resource adequacy right, because we've got all these variable renewables that are changing, and we need to make sure that that we can just we can have the lights on every single day, because that's the idea. Actually, utilities plan for one day of outage every 10 years. That's their gold standard that they want to go for, which is great, commendable. The PSC is concerned, however, that Northwestern's assessment of resource adequacy, for one reason or another, is inadequate. That's what they said in their notice of this investigation. We're not actually sure 100% what they think is wrong with it. They didn't say. But they said, it seems like there's some risk that we should plan for. And so what's their approach? They're going to host a conference in December. MEIC hopes to attend. We're submitting comments. And we'll talk about what's in our comments in a bit. But here's what we're worried about with this assessment. So they talk a lot in their comments about the risk of the risk of outages, and the need for more quote unquote baseload. Baseload resources are typically your fossil fuel resources, your coal, your natural gas, things that you can turn on when you need it. That's not a thing with renewable generation. It's increasingly becoming so as we have more and more advanced storage options that we can store that excess renewable energy when we need it. But the idea is that they're either going to have to increase the planning reserve margin, That's a word that I'll come back to. Increase the amount of basically energy that we need to build so that whenever the renewables flag, essentially, we have enough like fossil gas to turn on to make up for it. Now that is a very it's a very traditional stuck in the past model in terms of looking at supply and demand. It's like it's looking only at the supply side, right? And if you only look at the supply side, you're missing half of the picture, which is everyone that uses the electricity. That you're looking at the load as if that's a static, set in stone thing, but it's not. And we'll talk more about that in a second. So this is this picture, right? This is from Northwestern's IRP, and it shows all the colors are all their resources, and the red line is what we call the planning reserve margin. And that line is the amount, it's like if you meet 100%, if you meet a peak load, that's everything is turning on at once. It's a hot summer day, everyone's running the AC, that you're a peak load. And that is that dotted line. And then let's say you're planning for that load, but then all of the weather is messed up and it's actually hotter and all your solar for some reason is out and all your wind is not blowing, whatever. One of your gas plants is out for some reason. That happens. Fossil fuel is not as reliable as some people like to say. Then you need to plan for those situations. And that's what the red line is. It's a 16% on top of the 100% for reliability. It's like 16% extra energy resources that you need to have in order to keep the lights on. And so that's sort of the line they're planning for. And that's what some people say we need to actually increase. We need to make this red line higher, which means you need to procure more resources in these colored lines. And what does it mean to make that line higher? It means that we need to build more resources. What does it mean when we build more resources? It means we need to spend more money on resources. And that adds up to, let's say, $1 billion. This gray line right here is the lightest gray line is the Yellowstone generating station that Northwestern wants to build. That's $1 billion, that line. And that's about the size of this gap, right? And so and it's going up over time and they want to increase it higher. And that would mean we need to build more resources like that, which is not ideal. And it's not, I would argue, not efficient. What would the optimal solution be? Well, we have a huge range of modern energy resources ready to go for the clean energy transition. And that is not just renewables and storage, although they are extremely important and just got cheaper thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, but it also includes energy efficiency. That means you can do the same stuff in your house. You can use 750 kilowatt hours, but you make some efficiency upgrades and all of a sudden you're using 650. And that shaves off some dollars on your bill. It shaves off some of this peak load that they're looking at, and all around good news for the grid, except, well, it's not great for Northwestern because they don't get to sell as much energy, and then they have a slightly less energy need, and then all of a sudden they don't need to build as much plants as they get, and then all of a sudden they don't get to get that 8% back on the $100 billion that they spent. So they're not huge fans of energy efficiency, which is a problem. It's a huge problem. And similarly, demand response. I don't know if you guys heard this story from California a couple of weeks ago. They almost blacked out, but the reason they didn't was because when all the solar was going offline and electricity use from ACs was still going strong, they sent out a text to a bunch of people in all the people in California, and they were like, "Hey, we're gonna have a blackout if you don't turn down your AC." And so people, you know what, they did, and they avoided a blackout. Simple as that, for almost free. Now, it doesn't have to be free. You could actually set up programs where you pay people to do that. That would be creative. That would be smart. That would probably be cheaper than $1 billion gas plant, which, by the way, does not include the cost of fuel and pipelines. So there's also that. And then there's also the option of regional cooperation, which, you know what, I've talked a lot. I'm just going to skip that for now. You can come to me after class if you'd like to. What else are we looking at? So this is related. But what I just talked about is basically what we're going to say to the PSC on the resource adequacy front. Like, hey, why don't we actually look at the demand side a little bit? Why don't we try to actually bring our peaks down and shave our peaks, as they say? That's jargon, but what are you going to do? come to me after class. Major dockets we're watching at the PSC. We are looking at integrated resource planning rules. So this graph back here came from Northwestern's integrated resource plan. As something McKenna talked about, you got to do it every 3 years. You look ahead for 20 years. And why does it matter? It's you look at I'll get there in a second. You look at your supply, you look at your demand, you look at over 20 years, you're like, what resources do we have? What resources do we not have? How much is load going to grow? What are we going to do about it? Northwestern traditionally doesn't look at the demand side resources, all the cool stuff I talked about, demand response, energy efficiency, the real cost of renewables. They don't really want to look at it. That's fine. Well, it's not fine, it's bad. But they can do them. In terms of our legal system, in terms of how the PSC works, it is fine. But good news, the PSC, one more thing. This is also from their IRP. As you can see that in 2025, that big gray line, that's a 200 megawatt gas plant. So Laurel, the Yellowstone County, that's actually only 175. So this one's 200, 25 megawatts bigger. Who knows how much it's going to cost? But by all, it seems like that's what Northwestern's model, not Northwestern, what Northwestern's model, quote unquote, wants to build, which probably is what Northwestern wants to build because they kind of rig these models. But the PSC has an opportunity, a golden opportunity, thanks to a 2019 law, HB 9597, that looked at this planning process and looked at resource adequacy and looked at what Northwestern has historically done in its plans and was like, this is not actually quite good enough. This is looking at gas, pretty much. It's just an excuse to build more gas. That's what it looks like, at least based on what we're seeing. And we actually know that the cost of renewables is going down. We actually know that the cost of energy efficiency is the cheapest resource on the market. And it seems like Northwestern isn't really looking at those in its plans. So that's not ideal. How do we do that? Well, let's put in law, in statute in 2019, by the way, something that says the Northwestern's plan has to assess the full range of energy resources, including demand side, including energy efficiency and all that good stuff. And also have like a robust renewables scenario where it really appropriately values the cost of renewables. And then when it's actually going to build resources, make sure that it has a transparent process for how it selects the resource it's going to build based on its need that it identifies. That was in 2019. It is now 2022. We are close to 2023. The PSC has not yet passed any rules that put this law into effect, which is frankly frustrating. And as you can see, the utilities have, there's a lot going on in this article, but the utilities do not want this law actually passed. Why? Because they like what they're doing. They think they're doing a fine job. They don't think they're doing anything wrong. Their models give them the results they want and they're happy with it. And they say it doesn't really matter anyway, which I would push back on, because if you're going to do an assessment, why you should probably do it well and you should do it accurately. They spend all of this money, our money, doing this assessment. And this is what we end up with, 200 more megawatts of gas. Anyway, all you need to know about the IRP rules is they are still in process. That we got so close. We got 3-2 votes from commissioners on the PSC on the last version of rules, which the utilities didn't like. Utilities managed to complain. They actually kind of lied a lot in their testimony about what would actually happen if these rules were passed. And the commission backed down, but there's going to be another version coming out this winter, I think in January. And if you want to stay on top of this and stay on top of resource planning, please follow us. We are doing some events on IRP, and we'll keep you informed about both the current IRP and the IRP rules should you want to engage. This is actually one of those uncontested cases in which the public can weigh in. In terms of the IRP, the 2022 IRP, this is Northwestern's plan that they just put out. We are planning on putting in a bunch of work in order to discredit it, essentially. It just show that they did not really do they did not do their homework completely. They did not show their work. The models seem a little suspect in terms of its preference for gas. And frankly, gas is just I didn't even talk about this. It's bad for climate reasons. I think I don't even need to go into that anymore. But if you want to hear more, me talk about the IRP in depth, please come to one of these events in Helena, Great Falls, Billings, Bozeman, Missoula, or Butte. And if you're not on our email list already, which I'm sure you might be, get on it and sign up or just show up. Anyway, I've been talking too long. Does anyone else have any questions?
Feel free to come off mute if you have a question or raise your hand and we can do it that way. I think we hit all the questions that were in the chat. So we'll just wait a minute to see if anybody has anything.
I'm willing to accept that I did such a great job that no one has any questions. If that's the
I think you
case.
both did a pretty fabulous job. Oh, here we go. Gary, go for it.
So this is Gary Matson, and I just have a question about the PSC staff and a plan like Northwestern is putting together with their resource acquisition plan requires a lot of expertise to evaluate. And if the PSC has a staff, I know the PSC members themselves won't have the ability to really evaluate that technically. Does their staff have that ability? Can they look at the details of the Northwestern proposal and say this works or this doesn't work based on their own technical expertise within the PSC staff? Or would that require a third party?
Great question, Gary. And I am not one to cast aspersions. Like PSC staff made up of some very smart people, very competent people, and some very busy people. They are frankly understaffed. The PSC strategic plan has them bringing on like 6 more staff people. I think they maybe have like 30 right now. And it's not a question, I think, of like, are they smart enough, but it's like, do they have the resources? In the 2019 resource procurement plan, Northwestern, MEIC rallied up a bunch of people to basically come complain about it because it was not the best plan. And in response, the PSC hired an independent consultant to go over the plan and review it for them. So they do have that option should they want to sort of retain some independent consultants if they want to look into it. And I hope that they do, frankly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it kind of does. I'm not really worried about them being smart. I'm just concerned whether or not they have the expertise. You can be smart and not have the expertise. And like right now, Ascend Analytics is doing Northwestern's plan, and they're providing the technical expertise. And I don't know if the PSC has a person or persons on their staff that has the technical expertise to really evaluate what Ascend is proposing.
Right. I mean, I think it's on the public, honestly, to bring issues to the PSC about issues that we've identified. Like MEIC is planning on doing this. We've already identified many issues with the draft that Northwestern is going to has already put out, and obviously we'll go through the ETAC process and we'll submit our comments to them. We don't really expect them to change anything. But for example, like we asked them back in August if they would please consider the lower cost for renewables given the Inflation Reduction Act. And they said, oh, sorry, we have absolutely no time, like 2 months ago. So that's annoying. But, the PSC could very easily, the PSC can ask them to make changes, and they have, and Northwestern has issued supplements before. And we're hoping that something like that happens. I think the IRP is interesting because if it's discredited and people don't really trust what's in it, then it's not actually a useful document. And Northwestern essentially spent probably $1 million on Ascend Analytics for a document that no one really trusts, which is frustrating. It's also why it's so important that we fix the IRP process so that we can actually figure something out. I think McKenna had something she wanted to say.
Yeah.
Oh, just
Thank you, Ian.
To be an addendum to Gary's question, we have to remember that with the integrated resource plan, there is not an approval or denial process with the Public Service Commission. They offer comments and then we say, all right, done deal. We've heard from everyone. We're moving on. And we do this every 3 years. So there isn't anything binding in it, which is a consideration that we just want to be aware of in the current process that exists for the integrated resource planning.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks, McKenna. for pointing that out. Someone asked who hires the PSC staff members, the, in parentheses, partisan commissioners themselves. I don't actually know the answer to that question. I don't know if anyone does. McKenna, Katie, no, Anne?
I believe that the PSC has to approve of whoever is hired, but similar to other government agencies, the director, and the PSC currently does have like an executive director for operations now. If that's a little bit of a conjecture based on just how other agencies hire, they usually have their department head or whoever the direct report would be going through that interview process and hiring folks. And then I think the final sign off comes from the commissioners themselves. But the budget for how many people they can hire and how much of an operating budget they have comes from the legislature.
Very good. Thanks, McKenna.
Yeah, thanks everybody. We just have 1 minute left, so I think it's a good time to wrap it up. Thanks to Ian and McKenna for great, really engaging presentation. I learned a lot. And just to re-up the call to join MEIC, join MREA. We'll keep you in the know. We'll let you know when there's actions to be taken. And we're there to answer your questions. So I'm going to stop recording now.
All right.